Master's student studying clinical psychology at San Francisco State University. And my project is focusing on early adversity and coping efficacy and how that's associated with election-related distress in young adults. So just to provide a little bit of background, so a lot of research shows that many people who have experienced a distressing or traumatic event manifest post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so examples of a traumatic event can be gun violence, it can be sexual assault, or it can be a severe health diagnosis. And post-traumatic stress symptoms occur in two clusters of symptoms, so intrusion symptoms and avoidance symptoms. And so it's important to note that intrusion and avoidance, they can occur together in someone who has PTSD, or they can occur separately. So some examples of intrusion are involuntary distressing images, thoughts, or memories, having flashbacks, having distressing dreams, or having intense psychological and physiological distress at reminders of the trauma. And some examples of avoidance symptoms are efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, avoiding activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma, being unable to recall an important aspect of the trauma, or feeling very detached from other people. And so why do I care about the 2016 US presidential election so much? Well, this election was actually one of the most polarizing and emotionally evocative political events for young people in US history. And you might have experienced this. Maybe someone that you know might have experienced this. And so there were reports of widespread discontent with both candidates in this election. There was an unanticipated election outcome for a lot of people and heightened intergroup conflict. And so these reasons may have heightened emotional distress following the election. And research shows that this political event has actually been connected to PTSD symptoms in young adults, and this may be due to fear regarding policies discussed during the campaign trail, policies that very well could negatively affect young adults, and fear of a candidate with an audio recording describing sexual assault could be a factor as well. And this has been shown not to affect people psychologically, but also biologically as well. So Hoyt and colleagues demonstrated that there was an increase in biological stress indicators, so cortisol, following the election. However, it's really unclear which protective or risk factors have influenced young adult responses to this event. And what I mean by risk factors are factors that make individuals more vulnerable to developing PTSD symptoms following a traumatic event. And so some examples are ongoing stress, lack of social support, adverse childhood experiences, or commonly known as ACEs in the literature, and a family history of mental illness. And protective factors are factors that protect individuals from the likelihood of developing PTSD symptoms following a traumatic event. So some examples are a strong social support network, coping efficacy, higher education and income, greater senses of self-worth, and resilience. And in this study, I'm really interested in ACEs and coping efficacy. Some examples of ACEs are domestic violence in the home, sexual abuse, a family member going to prison or being mentally ill, or physical abuse and neglect. And coping efficacy is defined by the belief that you can manage and cope with any stress that comes your way. So, it may be very likely that young adults with a history of adverse childhood experiences and lower levels of coping efficacy were more negatively impacted by the 2016 presidential election, demonstrated by maybe increased intrusion and avoidance. And I had a couple of hypotheses for this study. So the first one is that greater ACEs would predict greater post-election traumatic stress symptoms. The second one is that lower levels of young adult coping efficacy would predict greater post-election traumatic stress symptoms. And the third final one is that coping efficacy would only reduce post-election traumatic stress symptoms among those who were exposed to lower levels of adversity. So in other words, coping efficacy would be protective, but only among those who are not at a heightened risk as a result of ACEs. So here is my sample. They were all San Francisco State University students. There was 843 people that filled out a survey, a couple of surveys, and the mean age was 22 years, with 76% of the sample being female and 24% being male. And as you can see here, there's a very diverse ethnic breakdown of the sample as well. So this was a cross-sectional survey study. So measures were completed online by self-report on very well-validated measures. So the impact of event scale is a post-traumatic stress screener specific to event-related distress. And this was administered to assess symptoms of avoidance and intrusion, specifically related to the 2016 US presidential election. Um, ACEs is a well-validated scale of early adverse experiences, and it's frequently referenced in the literature. So people are given a point for each experience they've had on the checklist, and it assesses exposure to adversity prior to the age of 18. It includes questions on exposure to emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, and household dysfunction during childhood. And the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale assesses coping efficacy, which again is one's perceived ability to manage stressful situations and related emotions. Additionally, to contextualize people's reactions to the election, we wrote these 3 questions for the study, assessing satisfaction to the election, to what extent they were distressed by the election, and the impact that the election had on close relationships that the participant had. And so we used the first and the third questions for statistical control. So we analyzed the data using SPSS and SPSS process macro, and a multiple regression analysis was conducted. 3 separate models were conducted, predicting intrusion, avoidance, and total symptoms, and we controlled for participant sets, satisfaction with the election, and the impact of the election on one's close relationships. And the independent variables of interest in each model included adverse childhood experiences, coping efficacy, and the interaction between ACEs and coping efficacy. And what did we find? So 35.5% of young adults scored in the clinical range on election-related traumatic stress. And this is notable. So it was higher than what was found in a previous study for a college population in Arizona. 23% of young adults endorsed 4 or more adverse childhood experiences out of 10 experiences. So that's quite high as well. And a greater number of ACEs significantly predicted total event-related distress, intrusion symptoms, and avoidance, but there was no direct association between coping efficacy and the type of traumatic stress symptom. And additionally, there was a significant interaction between coping efficacy and ACEs in the prediction of event-related avoidance and total event-related distress. And so here's a figure to show what I mean. This is the association between coping efficacy and event-related avoidance at high, average, and low levels of adverse childhood experiences. And you can see that greater coping efficacy here was associated with fewer avoidance symptoms among those who had fewer number of ACEs. So what does this all mean? So we actually replicated previous research, and more than a third of young adults reported clinically significant election-related traumatic stress symptoms. And ACEs was associated with greater election-related post-traumatic symptoms, but only those with low levels of ACEs, coping efficacy was associated with lower event-related avoidance symptoms. And so these results actually shed light on the impact of distress influenced by current events on the well-being of young adults. And so these results shed light on not just election-related events, but also events that are going on now, the coronavirus and this international pandemic. It also explores possibilities for intervention, specifically intervention on some of these negative outcomes that the election has brought on young adults. And this study also suggests that coping efficacy is only protective of event-related avoidance symptoms for young adults who have had low levels of adverse childhood experiences. So for those who actually haven't experienced a lot of trauma early in their life, if they have higher coping efficacy, they're less likely to experience event-related avoidance symptoms following the election. But this also means that greater coping efficacy was not protective against avoidance symptoms among those with a history of high childhood adversity. And so this calls into question to explore further research about future further research about potential protective factors that young adults with high levels of early adversity may benefit from. Because if coping efficacy isn't protective against some of these negative effects, what is? What will work? Um, so thank you so much for listening to my presentation.